Yesterday we began looking at Paul's relationship with this individual, a man by the name of Epaphroditus, a name that seemed to be very descriptive of his personality. You know, in the ancient world, oftentimes they delayed giving somebody what we'd call an adult name, because they waited till there was some definition in their character that would make their name describe them. Because the whole mindset was that as you're introduced to other people and you tell them your name, that name becomes descriptive of you. It tells them something about you right off the bat. For example, Paul, or his name was actually Saul of Tarsus, Saul from the city of Tarsus, and Saul means someone who was appointed. He had the idea that he'd been appointed by God to do some significant work. But after he was saved, he's changed his name to Paul, which was a Latin version, which simply means small. And Paul was diminutive in his physical size, but he was also small in his own eyes. He had gone from a very high exalted role as a very influential rabbi on the rise in Jerusalem. I don't have time to go into details, but basically the Sanhedrin, the ruling committee really of 70 people who ran the nation of Israel, it was a theocracy, had two concentric circles of 70 men around them. And the idea was that young rabbis and other leaders would work themselves up through the ranks till eventually they would hopefully sit on the ruling Sanhedrin council. Well, Paul was one of those rabbis who was probably in the first ring because he was only in his 30s, but he was working his way up to a high position, and we can see that he had a pretty high-minded view of himself, and God humbled him and broke him, and he from that point on referred to him as the little guy instead of trying to see himself as the big guy. But as Paul talks about Epaphroditus, here's a man who is lovely and charming, as his name says. Paul saw him as a brother in Christ, somebody he felt like he was related to in the most intimate ways, that he was a fellow worker, that he labored with Paul in the trenches, and also that he was a fellow soldier, which means that he had endured a lot of the hardships and conflicts that came with being involved in the ministry. But the fourth term that Paul gives to describe Epaphroditus is that he was an apostle. Basically, the word apostolos is translated messenger here, and that's basically what the word means. It means someone who is sent forth to represent another. We might call them an ambassador, or even an envoy, or somebody who is sent from one nation to another to communicate information. And that's really what the apostles were, and that's why Jesus described them as his apostles. In fact, I think it's really important to note that what we see today as the titles of leadership within the church were originally just descriptive of the jobs that people had, so that if somebody was an episcopos, he was a bishop, that meant he was a overseer, and essentially the lead pastor of a congregation would be somebody who was overseeing the welfare of the congregation. Today, when it's guys who wear red hats and long robes, is a misappropriation really of the title, because Jesus said that's the way of the Gentiles. Remember, he said the Gentiles will lord it over you. They want to have that higher position of a power so they can tell you what to do and kind of run your life and cause your life to fit into the fulcrum of their life. In other words, your purpose in life is to meet their needs and facilitate what they want. It's called an abuse of power. And Jesus said the greatest amongst you will be your servant, not your Lord. And so that whole idea that a bishop now is this highly exalted position is really a twisting of the biblical concept, because not that the high position is a problem as much as it often becomes a position of rulership for the advantage of he who rules, instead of being a way of serving the needs of people. So there's nothing wrong with acquiring power in a position to minister to other people. The danger is, and the temptation is, to use that power for selfish interests, and often to the disregard of the welfare of others. Well, we know in the New Testament that there were originally 12 messengers, the 12 apostles, and Jesus added one of them is a devil. So the message that Judas was sending or given to communicate was quite different than the one that the other 11 were chosen for. We know that later Matthias was chosen to take Judas's place. Some have argued that that should have been reserved for the Apostle Paul. And I don't know. I don't really necessarily embrace that, because Paul had a special commission. But his job was to be a messenger, one who brings out information and provides information. And so oftentimes we talk about missionaries as being people who have apostolic ministries. We don't necessarily call them apostles, because we've come to think of that as being a ruling position. But what's fascinating is if you look at the church in Jerusalem, where all of the apostles originated in their apostolic ministries, most of them did not stay. In fact, there's good indication that none of them stayed in Jerusalem. Later on, we find James, the half-brother of Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph, that he was the elder, the presbyteros, the bishop, if you will, over the church in Jerusalem. He had tremendous influence throughout the church, especially in the early years when that most Christians were coming out of the Jewish faith. He was a man of great faith, great moral and spiritual discipline, of really a deep commitment to the things of Christ. But essentially, he wasn't an apostle. He was a bishop who was ruling over a community of believers, and by extent, over many believers. So the idea of the apostles ruling over churches isn't something we really see much of. What we see them is getting up and going out, much the way we would do with church planters, missionaries, evangelists. Their idea, their commission was to go and take the gospel to every nation upon the planet. And so that's exactly what they were. So again, when we talk about the various offices of the church, it can get a little confusing because we have different terms. As I said, we have the word episkopos, which means somebody who is a bishop, but that literally again means somebody who oversees or who pastors over a flock. So in a very real sense, somebody who is a episkopos, a bishop, and a pastor are similar roles. And because the word pastor literally means a one who cares for sheep, or goats. That's a shepherd who's watching over a flock. And so the idea, the term pastor describes an activity or a part of ministry care that we have, not just simply an office or a position that we hold. And here again, this is one of the troubling dynamics, because I find that some men see being a pastor as being a career, when in fact it's simply a responsibility. When Jesus said to Peter at the end of John's gospel, he says, "Peter, if you love me, feed my sheep. If you love me, tend my sheep. If you love me, care for my sheep." Those injunctions that Jesus gave were really very descriptive of the kind of activities that a shepherd would engage in, that he not only would lead them into good pastures, he would watch over them and protect them, and he also would go through their fur or their wool to make sure that they didn't have any wounds or sores. He would apply balm if they had a cut or any kind of an injury. I think somebody shared with me one time, I thought was really quite insightful. He says that you could always tell the best shepherds because they had very soft hands. There was just an inherent gentleness about them. And the reason was because as they were going through the sheep's wool to see if they could find burrs or thorns or even injuries and wounds in their flesh, that the lanolin from the wool would get into their hands and their hands would naturally soften. And I think that's true when you talk about people who are involved in pastoral ministry, that if you start working with people and you see all sides of them and you see all the conflicts and the issues and the challenges they face, there's a gentleness, I think, that develops on your part towards those people. I have people in my own congregation who have really been damaged by life, that sin's been very unkind to them. And some of them have kind of different personalities. Some of them have some significant disabilities. And yet you develop this sense of compassion, because in really way you say, there but for the purposes of God, I don't want to say the grace of God, there but for the purpose of God, they've gone a different direction. My life has gone a different direction than theirs, but I'm not better than them. And talking with a lady just yesterday who has struggled for years with varying degrees of high anxiety and basically bipolar difficulties and maybe even schizophrenia. I don't know. I'm not that versed in the DMS charts, schedule, so I can't really make diagnosis. But nonetheless, she admittedly has had to battle a mental illness her entire life, and yet there's just a sweetness and a preciousness in this person, this humble sincerity. And I think that's, you look at someone like that, I do, and I think this is part of my congregation, part of my pastoral responsibility to be kind and loving and gentle and patient and forgiving, because I have people who are experiencing premature dementia, and it's tragic to see that happen. And yet you still have to have that kind of tender gentleness and care. I would just simply say to those of you who have elderly family members that you're caring for who are suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia, my wife and I too have people in our life like that, and I understand how very, very difficult that can be, especially when they have their anger episodes. But the whole thing that's important is to realize that, as Jesus said of those who crucified him, Father, they do not know what they're doing. And oftentimes people who behave badly, we want to react negatively, but they don't know what they're doing. So anyway, just an exhortation to be kind of patient and prayerful, that God would give you a godly perspective, a pastoral care and concern for these people. Well, again, out of time. Pick it up tomorrow, because actually I have some more stuff I want to talk about in terms of the roles and the positions that we have in the church. So see you tomorrow. Many blessings upon you and yours.